Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Way is in Training. This is a podcast exploring how warriors should train and fight, as well as how they should live. We will talk about technique, but we'll also dive deep into fitness, mindset, and strategy. We will explore leadership and philosophy as well. So whether you are a young soldier, a veteran police officer, a responsible armed citizen, or simply someone looking for an authentic life, let's examine how the lessons of combat and preparation for it can help us fulfill our potential. Let's explore the way together and learn how the discipline of training can show us our true selves amidst the chaos of life.
Morning, everybody. On this episode, I've got my good friend, AJ Zito. AJ, for those of you who don't know who he is a phenomenal shooter and trainer. He does a lot of stuff with Tim Herron and Scott Jadlinski. And he's also a phenomenal gunsmith. So, AJ, now that I've given my little take on it, why don't you tell everybody about yourself a little bit?
Sure. Like you said, my name is AJ Zito. I run a company called Practical Performance, which is where I run both the teaching and the gunsmithing under. Former military guy. Once I got out of the military, I did some EP work and some PSD on the teaching side. Then got into competitive shooting, and that kind of led me into gunsmithing, and then I got back into teaching, and here I am today where I teach and I build, and that's what I do.
Yeah, and definitely with a focus on 1911s and 2011s. So, let's talk about that for a second, because I'm a huge fan of, the prophet John Moses Browning, hallowed be his name.
Indeed.
So how did you wind up getting into 1911s and 2011s the way you are? Like, what led you to that? Both for shooting and for working on them.
Well, and they kind of blended into each other, really. So the first gun I really learned to shoot pistol-wise, and I mean learned how to shoot, was a 1911. And, 1911 and 45 ACP, God's caliber. So it was something that I had always liked the 1911. You see a 1911 come out in a movie when I was a kid, and it was like, yeah, that thing's awesome, right? So you grow up and you're like 1911s, and then eventually I get my my first actual gun that I learned to shoot on. That was a 1911. But as I continued, then I went into the military, and where I was at, there were no 1911s. Everything was an M9 Beretta system. Got out of the military, and actually, right when I got out, I kind of stepped away from the 1911 for quite a bit. I had never, other than the M9, I had never shot a gun in 9mm before, because all the 1911s I had ever seen were in 45. And at that time, that was the most prominent variation of it. So I shot other guns for quite a while. But every now and again, there was this like pull back to the 1911. Like I pick it up in my hand out of the safe, and I'm like, it just feels right,
Yeah.
And then I discovered 2011s, and I was like, oh, hey, now, wait a minute. I don't have to give up magazine capacity, and I can do all the 1911 things with a double stack. Okay. So I carried a 2011 really early on, 2000, I want to say 2012, 2011, somewhere in there, I started carrying a 2011. That kind of really started pushing me into the real shooting of 1911s and 2011s. And I carried a 2011 for quite a while. Then when I got into competitive shooting, I started off in production division, like most people do, picked up my M&Ps and shot those. But there was always something about the 1911. And I had I had a custom 1911 built for me from my good friend Bob Miller, and who would later on become, a gunsmithing mentor of mine. Just didn't know it was going to happen at the time. And that gun, I just kept running and running and running. And I was like, that's it. I'm done with other things. I'm just going to shoot 1911s, and everything else, just kept bringing me back to the 1911. It's like, oh, I'm having trigger problems. Well, I don't have these trigger problems on my 1911. I'm having issues, with returning the gun. Well, I don't have that problem here. So it really, from the shooting side, really just kept drawing me back in, till eventually I was like, I don't know why I'm really messing with any of this other stuff, because it's never going to do what I want, because it's not the gun I want. And based on that shooting and really just loving the system, when I was, getting out of the contract teaching world and looking for something to do in between, I thought, well, I was working for a school in Colorado at the time, and I was already fixing all their guns, but I didn't know anything about anything. I was like, I could probably get paid for this in the dry times. So maybe I'll go to gunsmithing school. And hey, I really like 1911, so maybe I'll learn how to build 1911s. So that really started me down that road of, I went to gunsmithing school specifically to learn how to build 1911s. And it was more, just, yes, I wanted to be able to do it as a side job when I wasn't, doing other things. But it was more too that I wanted things to go the way I wanted them to go, and I wanted to have control. And I really hate having excuses. Like, I hated blaming the gun for problems. Like, I had a myriad of guns, the Gen 1 M&P, the day I discovered it would not hold, tighter than an 8-inch group at 10 yards, and I'm like, oh, well, no wonder shooting 25-yard B8s isn't working out for me, and I had other guns that were similar. So I got really tired of it. And I figured, well, if I'm building it, then the problem is my fault. So I got no one else to blame but me. And I like that aspect. So that really got me interested in, the gunsmithing for myself, and then, for other people as well. So yeah, that's a kind of a long way around how I ended up here. But yeah, it's the two worlds of the 1911 with me just kind of converged. And there were times in there too where I'd be like, oh, I want to play in this division. And then I'll play in, like carry optics or something for a little bit. And then I'm like, nah, I like 1911s. Let's go do this. So yeah.
Well, and your favorite gun, if I'm correct, but it's the one that I've seen you shoot with the biggest smile on your face and the little giggle of glee, is actually that single stack 9mm with an optic on it. The hard chrome one.
Yeah.
Is it hard chrome or stainless?
No, it's straight up stainless because it's still in the white. It has no finish on it. That's a gun I built when I was still teaching. I taught at a college for gunsmithing for about 5 years. The one I actually graduated from, and then later on started teaching. I used to build, when my students would build a gun during their third semester, I would build it along with them so they could see the actual process and everything. So that gun started, it was just, I just so happened to have a Nighthawk frame and a Nighthawk slide in my shop, and some Ed Brown safeties and a cart barrel. I was like, oh man, because I didn't have a customer gun that was going to be in a configuration that I wanted to show the students at the time. So I just hodgepodge this thing together, and I grabbed a part from here and a part from here, and I put it together with all intentions of, once that semester was done, I would just, finish this gun, sell this gun, and move on. And then I started test firing it, and I was like, ooh, really like this. Well, because at the time, most of my guns got about 250 to 500 rounds before they went to the customer. So we could hash out all, any potential issues and stuff. When I got to that 250
Wait,
round
you mean
mark,
shooting a 5-round group is not enough to see if a gun runs?
No, sir, it is not. It is not. Believe it or not, that is not a statistical.
But I thought that was the industry standard.
Well, it is, and that's not good. Oh, yeah. But yeah, so I just started shooting that gun, and then I realized, down the road, oh my God, I've got 5,000 rounds through this gun, and I haven't finished it. I guess this is my gun now. And now I'm to the point where I think that gun's sitting at just under probably 40,000 rounds total. And I still haven't finished it. I mean, there's still blending and no finish on the gun. It's still stainless. So my new plan is I'm just going to shoot that gun until I wear out the barrel. Then I'll put a new one in, and then I'll finish the gun. But it'll get hard chrome when it's done anyways.
Yeah, well, I mean, it looks really good and it shoots well. And
yeah,
and the look of sheer pleasure on your face when you shoot it is definitely enjoyable for everybody around. That's for sure.
Well,
excuse me. So I got a thought here, and this is something just kind of occurred to me while we were talking about this. So first off, for everybody who doesn't know, you're definitely an extremely good shooter. You're a masterclass shooter and a good masterclass shooter. You're Tim Herron's pretty much solid training partner. Even if a lot of it's over the phone, you guys are always bouncing ideas off each other. How has the process of gunsmithing informed your process of training and shooting? And kind of what I mean by that is I've noticed that like in competitive shooting, it seems like certain population groups are overrepresented in the high levels of competitive shooting. And it seems like it's musicians, engineers, and IT guys, because they have that detail-oriented, process-focused mindset, right? And other things that kind of have that same outlook on looking at things.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that has to do with, the fact that shooting is a process-oriented activity. But my personal belief also is that it's that training properly is so much about following a process that works for you and paying attention to all the details of the data, using that to inform how the process continues. Now, would you agree with that? Do you think that the act of being a gunsmith, because it's so detail-oriented, helps you out with kind of developing your training style as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, I'll tell you, because I was a competitive shooter beforehand and had a lot of time, I think actually the process in the shooting helped me more to become a better gunsmith, right? Because it gave me direction. I already had an understanding of a process in which to make certain things happen, right? Within my own practice and training and different processes in order to gain different results. And putting those towards gunsmithing really kind of changed the way I approached gunsmithing. But like you said too, they bounce off each other. Like becoming more detail oriented in my gunsmithing and the processes I use in my gunsmithing, like I will absolutely sit there and go, oh man, this makes total sense. I need to do this for other things. And you find out that, that overlap really just kind of changes the game. At least for me, gunsmiths are a weird breed. I mean, if anyone's, most people nowadays, unfortunately, may have never even talked to or met an actual gunsmith because we live in we shoot something until we're not happy with it. Then we get rid of it or throw it away, or it doesn't work. We send it back to the factory.
So many of the modern striker fired guns, and you're the expert, you tell me, but this is I know for a fact that the reason the SMUs went away from the 1911, 2011 style guns and went to the Glocks was because you didn't have to be a gunsmith.
Yeah.
Because it's like Legos, it's plug and play, right? And
exactly.
Because of that, I think, and that I think is both the strength and the weakness of something like a 1911, right? And I was having this conversation with somebody else recording a podcast the other day, and for the life of me, I can't remember who it was because I've done 10 of these in 2 weeks. But for me, because I rode Harleys for decades, right? Mm-hmm. And I built a lot of my own Harleys. Or at least customize them if I didn't build them from the ground up. I built several from the ground up and I customized everything else.
Sure.
And to me, a Harley is kind of a lot like a 1911 in the sense that if you set it up right and you know how it needs to be set up, you'll have a very reliable, dependable motorcycle that for the kind of motorcycle it is performs very well. Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not going to be it's not a race bike. It's not meant to be a race bike. But
Right.
for what it's designed to do, if you set it up correctly, it's going to really perform. But you have to know those parameters and how to go about that, and little tricks and tweaks and how to do it. And to me, with my limited, I like to say that I'm trying to become a gunsmith with an F to distinguish me from the real gunsmiths, right?
Indeed.
So, but like, it seems to me that it's like I was watching an Atlas, because Atlas has a bunch of good videos on gunsmithing that I found on YouTube. And I was watching one of their videos the other day, and they were talking about how a lot of even big name builders now have the holes in the frame for the various pins and safeties and everything not trued up properly. So the gun will never run right no matter what you do. Right. So it's little things like that. And I think that, like I said, it's both the strength and the weakness of the 1911 platform. And I think that like that deep dive and understanding that gives you that mental process. At least it would seem to me. I'm not you. I'm not a gunsmith with a TH by any means. Maybe when I'm too old and broken to run around in the range, maybe I'll try to play around with that. Right. But so like it's that process of understanding those little things that make something work or don't, and how to set those things up correctly. It's no different than your grip on shooting a pistol, right? Like everybody looks at the way the grip appears without understanding what's actually making it work. And the appearance is secondary to the pressures that actually make it work. Am I making sense?
Oh, 1,000%. And that you're absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. We see, speaking of appearance versus what actually is, I mean, it is not hard for a company to build a 1911, which is part of the problem, because just looking like a 1911 does not mean that gun is going to run at all, because of the intricacies of what is going on inside it. So while it may, look the part, it absolutely is not the part, because of those processes and, the things you need that gun to do in order to work properly. And yeah.
Well, and the other cool thing about them too, and then we'll get back to training, but I just got to talk about this because I love them probably as much as you do in my own amateurish way, right?
Sure.
So there are very few designs that were created over a century ago that are still in common use worldwide. And 3 of those designs belong to John Moses Browning. I mean, we're talking about 3 things that are still in use by military and law enforcement across the world over a century. In some cases, substantially over a century since they were designed.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty impressive feat when you think about it.
Absolutely. And that's just the major 3 designs. When you start looking at how many systems today integrate some variation or slight variation on a Browning design, like the one I use all the time in classes, like look at the barrel lockup, the way your barrel locks up in your striker fired gun. That is, I will almost put money on it. I don't care whose gun you look at. That is a slight modification on a Browning high-powered design for the barrel lockup. In Glocks, in M&Ps, in all these other guns out there, it is simply taking Browning design and maybe cutting a little bit out here or there in order to work for that gun. But the design itself belongs to Browning. And yet, here we are today, 100 plus years later.
Yeah, because it was actually, when did he actually design in 1911? Because it wasn't in 1911. It was like 1890 something, wasn't it?
Yeah. So you can trace it back to like, you've got variations of the 1911. Right? For those that don't know, the reason it's called the 1911 is because, the patent is granted on February 14th of 1911, happy Valentine's Day and everything. And that's when it truly gets adopted and blessed off on as the 1911 platform.
Wait, that means I've got to buy my wife Angela another 2011 or 1911 for Valentine's Day.
Yes, because that's the only appropriate Valentine's Day gift.
Well, she'd actually appreciate
it. Yep. Yeah.
All right. I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry, brother.
No, not at all. But yeah, so you can. It depends on where you really want to pick up the start. Like, because we have variations in 1901, 1905, and the eventual, pistol I guess I'll call it a contract, right? That the 1911 initially filled. Those tests and trials had been going on for years at that point before the actual adoption or acceptance of the 1911 platform. So in its first variation, right? And we've had multiple variations. That's one of the amazing things about the 1911. Most people don't recognize what it was and what it is, because they are not necessarily the same thing. But you take, for instance, right, the original variations of the 1911, there was no grip safety on that gun. It did not exist. That was a direct request from the U.S. Army in order
cavalry, right?
Correct. Yeah, they wanted a drop safe mechanism on the gun, so if they were to drop it off their horse, they would not shoot themselves or their horses, in combat. Which is really funny today with all the silliness of drop safeness. People have forgotten how things are designed and where they come from. A steel frame gun with the balance point weighted at the rear does not fall on the muzzle. It falls on the back of the gun, which is why the grip safety is the way it is. It stops the movement of the trigger to the rear due to inertia. Right. Versus, the thumb safety, which actually blocks movement of the sear. So we just have to understand. But that was not in Browning's initial design. That was a direct request from the Army. And frankly, here I am today, and I think it's one of the major benefits of the gun when set up correctly. And therein lies part of the problem.
I love the grip safeties on my guns. The only ones that I've deactivated were on my open guns, which I'm actually probably never going to shoot again, because those were only loaded. Well, I'm just not going to shoot open anymore. There's no need now that you have limited optics.
Right.
So, but the reason I deactivated those and didn't mind was because those were never loaded except right before I shot something.
Right.
Like they weren't carried. They weren't staying loaded at the house. They weren't being carried around. I love the grip safety because my preferred method of carry is appendix.
Absolutely.
And it's so funny because people visually freak out, not so much anymore now that the 2011's experienced the resurgence it has. But prior to that, people would freak out when they realized I was carrying cocked and locked appendix, but they would be carrying a Glock cocked and locked appendix, which really doesn't have a safety. I mean, it's got a little trigger safety, but that doesn't, yes, it's technically a safety, but you know what I mean? Whereas
it's a safety that does not stop anything from truly pressing the trigger. Whereas the grip safety on a 1911, I don't care how much pressure you put into it, without deactivating the grip safety, you can't press the trigger. It doesn't work. So,
and what I would always tell guys is, look, if I put my thumb on the hammer and take the back of my hand off of the palm of my hand off of the grip safety and activate the thumb safety, I have 3 redundant safety mechanisms to prevent me from removing myself from the gene pool.
Yep.
When I holster that gun up. And I like that. Like you said, you just have to set them up right so that when you get your grip on the gun, it disengages the grip safety.
Right. And that's I'll tell you, one of my biggest pet peeves in this entire world is watching people put things like Ranger bands or duct tape on their grip safeties. Because really, number one, you're creating a situation that I'm not sure you really want to go into. Again, you lose the redundancy of the safeties. You lose the ability of the grip safety to actually work when your problem is more likely that you are gripping a 1911 incorrectly from the get-go, because, we're seeing a resurgence in 1911s and 2011s from people that grew up in a Glock world. When I started shooting, I grew up in the tail end of a 1911 world that was getting Glocks on the mainstream, right? And SIGs and stuff like that. And so there's been this kind of shift. Instead of 1911 guys learning Glocks, we've got Glock guys learning 1911s, and they don't necessarily think about the whole problem in its entirety, like holstering the gun or walking around with the gun or any of the other instances where grip safety has huge advantages when set up correctly. And
it's not, it is not that difficult to tune the grip safety. There's a million videos on it on YouTube. It's, it's a leaf spring. You just make sure it's set. And if you don't do like I did the first time and go too far too fast.
Yeah.
Because it is a pain in the butt trying to make it right. But as long as you go a little bit at a time and take your time with it, spend the afternoon watching TV and doing just a little tweak. And before you know it, it's set up where it's just the right amount for you.
Right. And that's on the pressure end. If you really want to fix the disengagement, right, that's some file work on the arm, as you know, right?
Yeah, a little nub coming in. Yeah.
Right. And that's really the major control. But I mean, any gunsmith worth their salt should be able to tune up a grip safety the way you want it. Typically I tell people most guns come from the factory where it requires 50% engagement in order to deactivate that. That's a little on the heavy side in my opinion, for a carry gun. I want that thing ideally 33%, right? You take the third movement or about 25% is where my personal guns are set up. So they require just a little bit of movement in order to deactivate, but they should be set up correctly for you. Yeah.
All right, here's a question for you before we segue back to training.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts for 9mm, 1911 and 2011s? What are your thoughts on recoil spring weights? Because I have an opinion of what I've done to all my guns. And I think we've actually talked about this before, but for the audience out there, I kind of want to get it out there. Like, so what do you think is an ideal weight for a reliable but high performing 1911 or 2011 chambered in 9mm?
Yeah, I'll tell you. So I typically I'll start basing that off of barrel length, right? But then I base everything off of like a 5-inch barrel length. Ideally, right, in order to give you the widest range of usability, 12 or 13 pounds is probably going to give you the best reliability, the best feel of the gun, the best return of the gun, somewhere right around there. Now, recoil springs, are set up to work in conjunction with the mainspring of the gun. So there's some balance issues in there. But for my money, for most people, if you're shooting regular, off the rack, bought it at, Sportsman's Warehouse ammo, a 13-pound recoil spring in a 9mm gun is probably going to do the best for you. Some guns, if they're more on the custom side, probably can get away with a little bit lighter, like an 11-pound. Or a 12-pound recoil spring. Most of my guns live with a 12-pound recoil spring in them. If you're the guy that shoots only duty ammunition or only carry ammunition, probably going to start at the 13, maybe work up to a 14, depending on who built your gun and how that gun was built. I will tell you, my carry gun has a 14-pound recoil spring in it right now, because it's set up for, my defensive ammo, and that's what sets the gun up returning the way I want it to. So, yeah.
And how would that change for like a 4 1/4, like a staccato P, since that's the common 2011 these days?
Right. So I'll tell you, for the staccato Ps, I can pretty much use the same kind of idea as that 13 pounds. But as a rule of thumb, the shorter you make the gun or the shorter you make the barrel, the heavier the spring rate needs to be. So you might see that instead of being closer to the 11 or 12, you might need to start at the 12 or 13 and build up from there. That's where I see those guns most happy, is probably about that 12-pound, 13-pound mark, as well, with the proper spring in it. The CSs, again, they've become very popular too. They, utilizing a recoil master system. I don't prefer the recoil master system. I don't like dual systems or variable power systems. They can be set up closer to a 14-pound recoil spring in order to set them up correctly. But again, recoil springs, this is a a starting point.
Right.
There's going to be a difference, very much so, based on who built the gun, how the gun was built, how the gun balances, what ammo you're shooting in the gun. But, easy rule of thumb, start at 13 pounds.
Oh, I just thought of a segue back into training, but I'm going to ask one more question about the recoil springs. Now, what about like an integral comp, like the XC, or I think there's a couple of other 2011s with the integral comps out there now as well. So
Sure.
That would make for a lighter spring. So what would be the starting point there, you think?
Correct. Right. So I tell most people, like, I find like the XC runs extremely well at about the 10 or 11 pound mark. Right.
That's exactly what I've got in mind, as opposed to the 7 it came with from the factory.
Yeah, exactly. And I've talked to Staccato about this before, and we've had this conversation. From the factory, the guns are sprung too light. And I get it. They want the guns to have a certain feel, a certain action, the way that they're intending them to run. But for me, that's too much on the light side, right? We're inducing a lot of premature wear on the guns. We're beating the frames up, and we're actually not creating that great of a feel for my preference in shooting either. So yeah, about that 10 pound is where I'll start, and go up from there. But typically you'll find it somewhere between that 10 and 11 pound mark.
And I found that really cut down on cleaning, or lack of cleaning, I should say, induced malfunctions.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We used to see this back in the day with a lot of guys when they were shooting 1911s and 45 ACP. Traditionally, like the Colt Gold Cup models, right? They would ship with a 16-pound recoil spring designed for competitive ammunition. However, guys would not use light loaded competitive ammunition in it, and they'd be running that, and you get the gun a little bit dirty, you get the gun a little bit dry, and all of a sudden, here comes the king of feedway stoppages. However, if you were to maybe plus that recoil spring up to about, typically in my 45 caliber carry type duty guns, I typically set them up at about the 18 pound mark, 18 to 18 and a half pound recoil springs in the 45 guns. When they get to that point, a little bit, neglected, a little bit dry, or I've been shooting a ton that day, 5, 6, 700 rounds, it will give me enough behind the gun to really start putting it into the chamber. And we see the same thing on the XCs or any of the integral comp guns. It gives you just that touch extra, which is nice.
Yeah. Well, and like I remember when the Roland Special was the big thing?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Yes.
And that was like right around the beginning of me starting my training company, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, and I still to this day, because comps are even more popular now than they were during the Roland Special era, right?
Right.
But you get a lot of people that have put a comp on their gun and haven't resprung it for the comp.
Yep.
And
that's one of
they
the
wind
major
up with
problems I see.
Not only a recoil impulse that's kind of funky, but they also wind up with a lot of malfunctions because they're not getting enough juice to run that slide because it's all going out the comp.
Exactly. There's a misconception as to what comps do. And what you really need to understand is you're robbing energy from the gun. That's what you're doing. That's the point of a comp. So if you're going to rob energy from the gun, you need to equate for robbing that energy from the gun, right? And there's two ways to go about it. You can find the hottest ammo with the highest pressure you can get and run that through it, which may work, right? Or if you're a little bit smarter, running, at least the normal type ammos, right? Spear Lawman has always run really good out of those comps, right? You need to respring the gun. Like, that 18-pound Glock recoil spring is not the right answer. I promise you. In fact, for me, that's oversprung without a comp. So whatever, it's set up for a certain thing. But yeah, you got to respring those guns. You got to do it.
So let's segue from that back into shooting and training, right? So talking about recoil impulse on the gun and how you were liking it, how you like to have it set up. So let's talk about that for a minute, because this is one of the things that I think people really misunderstand, in my opinion. everybody wants this feeling of the gun being as flat as possible.
Yeah.
And everybody wants the sight, the dot to track within the window and never leave. And everybody wants it to track in a straight line.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that, I mean, all of the things being equal, are you better off if the dot doesn't return, doesn't leave the window? Absolutely.
Sure.
All of the things being equal, are you better off if the dot moves in a straight vertical line and comes right back down? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But what's more important, because people like look for that and they ignore the fact that the dot bounces below at the bottom and comes back up and they're wasting time.
Right.
Or they emphasize the wrong things. The important part is that the dot returns to the original point of aim reliably and consistently and easily every time. The other stuff is nice. Like I said, don't get me wrong. I mean, but that's the stuff that chase after you have that. Yeah. Like, that's the small things. The big thing is just making sure that you're aiming at the exact same place when the gun is done doing its recoil arc, I think.
And I'm in total agreement, right? There's a priority level to all of those things you mentioned, right? For me, I don't care how flat your gun shoots. I don't care so much where it leaves from or where it goes to. But I'll explain more on that here in a second. But the major priority is that no matter what, the gun is or the sights are returning to the same spot they left from with minimal effort, right? One of the big problems I see in the training world, specifically 1911 shooters, for most people, I'm sure they're familiar. My flagship class is my 1911-2011 driver class. That's the class I teach more often than anything else. It's a performance shooting class purely based on the 1911-2011 platform guns. But one of the big problems we see is a lot of people care more about their gun shooting flat than their dot or their sights returning to the spot they left from. What makes you shoot fast, right? If we want to talk about speed, right? What makes you become that person that can shoot sooner is not the gun being flat, though we can make the argument it can help you the flatter the gun shoot. Yeah. But the key here is the sights returning to where they left from as soon as we can possibly get them there. But the problem is individuals put so much energy into their gun and they stop understanding how efficient the guns really are. Like I see this constantly. So people start bearing down onto the guns and they really start trying to drive the guns in recoil, and they end up over returning the gun more often than not. And that costs you time. When really on the 1911 and 2011, the answer is more often than not, you need to do less work on that gun. Like you really do. You don't need to do the things you needed to do on that, that Glock or that HK or that, SIG, God forbid, or any of the other systems.
All the SIG jokes are getting old. We should just go ahead and drop that.
Hey, well played. Can't do it. It'll explode. So
for all the SIG shooters out there, I'm just joking. I kid.
I don't. Seriously. Get a different gun. You can't ignore the fact that there's a problem here.
Yeah, no,
anyways,
they're going off in the holster, but they do shoot well. I do. I mean, for a striker fire gun, I do enjoy the way they shoot. Yeah. It's the other stuff.
Yeah.
And let's just rather than turn this into a bashing session, let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you though. Well, and that's I think one of the reasons why, because I mean, you can absolutely win world championships with a Glock. I mean, look at Robert Volker.
Sure.
I mean, you can do it.
We've seen it.
It's just a lot more work and it's not as much fun.
Yeah. Doesn't look as good either, let me tell you.
No. And it is just as important to look cool as it is to be cool.
Yeah. You right. But that's a great point, right? So everyone typically points to, Bob, when they say, well, you don't need a 2011. No one needs anything. You could win that championship with anything. I mean, look at Nils Jonasson. He's shooting a Canik, and we've got JJ shooting Berettas, and we got Eric Graffel shooting CZs. We've got a bunch of different guns out there, right? But something you notice about a majority of those, Bob is the exception to this rule because he isn't sponsored primarily by a gun company like Glock, right? He shoots for Terran and whatnot. But a majority of shooters at the top of the game, when given the choice, right? And the game doesn't really matter. It can be IDPA, USPSA, Bullseye, and any of the other, Steel Challenge, whatever it is. When given the choice, a majority of the top level competitors all choose some type of 1911 or 2011 platform gun. And there's a reason for that, right? There are things that gun is capable of that other guns simply are not. It's just when set up correctly. It's not like you're going to go pick that gun up from Walmart, or I don't think Walmart sells guns anymore, or your local, Sportsman's Warehouse or something, and that gun be competitive. It's not going to be that way. They are highly tuned. I talk about them as being Ferraris, right? We're racing Ferraris here. We're not racing, Honda Civics. So they're not the same.
You mean Yugos can't win the stock car races?
Yeah, I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying there's a high probability that it won't happen, right? Now that being said, everyone's like, well, it's the Indian, not the arrow. You're absolutely correct. It is the Indian, not the arrow. But it really helps when you've got a straight arrow. So the arrow has a say in things.
Well, and it just makes it, you have to do less work. Like I shot Glocks for years.
Exactly.
Both in the Army and on the police department, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I made master with a Glock. Like it's not like, you can shoot them really well, but it's just a lot more work. It really is. And for me, and I'm not knocking anybody else's choices, you know what I mean? But for me, it's just more fun to shoot a 1911 or 2011. I just enjoy it more. I like the way it feels in my hands. I like the recoil impulse. I like, the ergonomics of it, and not just the grip, but also the controls. I like the ergonomics of all of that. Like it suits me, and I like it. And I think it's just more enjoyable than grinding away with, it does say perfection on the box. They wouldn't lie to us.
Right. All the perfections. All of it. Yeah. But you're absolutely correct. It is, it's easier, right? I tell people a lot, especially in classes, right? The 1911 platform, 2011 platform. And for people that I keep saying it that way, 2011s are 1911s. They're just a double stack variation of a 1911. Yeah. Plus now that Staccato has branded, or trademarked 2011, so on and so forth, right? It's the same mechanism. It's the same system. So people don't get too wrapped up on 1911 or 2011. They're all 1911s.
Every part from the upper end can switch over.
Yeah, absolutely. The only differences in the guns are the triggers themselves and the magazine releases. Right.
Yeah, the trigger bow and the mag release. That's
exactly. And if you want to get into it, right, like, yes, it has a different grip module than a single stack gun, but okay.
It's got room for the double stack magazine. That's
exactly. So
there's a cause. I know correlation is not usually equal causality. However, in this case, I think we're pretty safe in saying that's why.
Yes. I think that would be acceptable for sure. So like I was saying, it's a very easy gun to shoot. It's a difficult gun to master. And that's typically why we see two types of shooters picking the 1911. There's either those that are just getting into kind of shooting and they like the 1911. So they go pick up, your Rock Islands or your Arms Corps or Citadels or whatever. Right. And they're just getting into that gun because it's easy to shoot. And then you have to look at the top end because then there's the masters, because the 1911 truly is a master's gun. It requires a far more educated end user behind it. someone that has to understand the relationship between sights and triggers and the things you can do differently, with triggers in order to get the gun to do what you want based on the difficulty of the shot. You have to understand manipulations of thumb safeties and grip safeties and placement on the hand. You have a little different, when we get into the, different styles of reloads, things you can't do on, things you can do on other guns you can't do on the 1911. And this all comes into play. So it requires more dedication on the high end.
I would argue too that it's a function of the same things that make it shoot better for beginners, because the trigger is so easy to press, has such a short reset and take up, moves exactly straight to the rear. It is both easier to do a good trigger press and easier to move the gun.
Bingo. You're absolutely correct. One of the things I mentioned in that class too, right? Everyone goes to every firearms class, right? Any firearms class that you take, where they talk to you about trigger press, everyone tells you the same thing. You need to press your trigger straight to the rear. However, when you look at it, there is only one pistol platform out there that actually has a trigger that moves straight to the rear. And that is the 1911 platform. So, again, it's like, well, why is this gun, why can I pull so much out of this gun? Well, the design lets me pull. I press straight to the rear and the trigger moves straight to the rear. There's no hinging, right? The barrel lockup system, just everything about it is fantastic.
So I do want to make one slight detour in our conversation because we're almost out of time, right?
Oh my
we're
gosh,
almost done. I know. Yeah. It's every one of these has gone like this because, I resisted doing this podcast for a long time because I was thinking, do I really want one more thing I have to do for my business on a regular basis? Right. And then I started doing it a couple of weeks ago. And I told you, like, I've just been grinding out because I want a backlog. I want to have this, a series of episodes in the queue. So if I go on vacation or if I have a big match and I'm prepping for it, it's okay if I skip a week here and there. And then I can catch up later.
Yep.
Right. So I resisted this for so long. I got to tell you, I've had such a great time because all I'm doing is talking to my friends about the things that I love to talk about and just sharing it with the world. So it's like an excuse for me to catch up with guys like you and Tim and Bob Vogel and Frank Proctor and Leskis Martoni and, our buddy Riley Bowman, and like just all these guys that I just love talking to. And all we're doing is talking like we'd be talking over beers anyway. So it's actually been a great experience. But anyway, what I wanted to talk about, because this was the thing that I got from your joint class with Tim, from you specifically, from Tim as well, but you were the one that kind of talked about this the most, at least in the beginning of the class, the first time it was brought up in the class, is the way you guys approach your logbook, because it changed the way I maintained my data collection for my shooting. Sure. Specifically, like, looking at consistency over PRs, and just like the way you guys organize the data collection you do. Do you mind giving everybody a rundown of that real quick? Because I think that's money, man. That's golden.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Right. So understanding that in order to progress as a shooter, we have to be able to track performance. Right. It's one of the greatest tools we have. And I always relate it back to like the gym. Anyone that's done any type of like significant real, Olympic type lifting or any type of real lifting, we live or die by our logbooks. And taking that same idea into the shooting world and the practice world, right? I cannot get anywhere if I don't know where I'm starting. I have to know where I start, right? And we start that with the logbook, right? Understanding the logbook is a way to reference and build consistency within your shooting. So some of the things within there, right? Like we're constantly tracking the date. And the reason we track the dates is very much so we can see, when I'm shooting, what I'm shooting. And along with that is, like the time. One of the things Tim and I talk about in the class is we are very different shooters. Over time, when you track when your practice sessions are, you will start recognizing some consistencies or inconsistencies. I am a morning performer, 100%. I perform the best in my practice in the morning. Tim is the opposite. He performs the best in the afternoons or around that noon to 5 p.m. kind of time frame. So when we as competitive shooters start choosing, AM, PM schedules, I bias my schedules towards morning performances. When I can, Tim is the opposite, right? But it's important that we understand that what we're looking for is those patterns. And that's really what we're getting into with our logbook is developing the recognition of patterns in there. So once we set that up, we need to build consistency. And that comes down to, one of the biggest problems we have as shooters is we like a bunch of different things, right? Gun jumping is probably the number one problem we have as shooters.
I have a good friend, and he was actually, we shoot local matches together all the time, and he was one of my online coaching students for a while. Mm-hmm. He is a nationally, like on the podium, nationally ranked Masters Olympic lifter, 45 and up. Like he's a really good athlete, amazing athlete. If I could get him to stay with the same gun for more than one match in a row, he'd have made Grandmaster in a year. And he's going to listen to this. He's going to know I'm talking about him. This is for you, John. I love you, brother, but just pick a goddamn gun.
I'm going to back that up. You 100% right. 100% right. And that's a plague. And don't get me wrong. I'm guilty of this just as much as anyone else at certain points. As a performer, we are looking for the next advantage, right? So there are going to be times where we're like, well, if I do this or I pick this, it might give me that slight advantage. What I've come to over years of playing this game, at one point I shot one gun for 3 years straight, never shot a different gun. My performance went through the roof. And then I fell off.
Imagine that.
I know, weird. You mean the more you do something the same way with the same tools every time, the better you'll get? That's crazy talk. Something about repetition.
I refuse to believe it. That's insanity.
Yeah. I know. The next newest thing is clearly going to be the best.
That is misinformation. I'm going to report you to the authorities.
Oh, no. But yeah, so, so we end up going down this road. If I could shoot one gun for everything, I would be a happy man. Gun obviously would be that stainless single stack that I shoot. That's my carry gun. I shoot it in limited optics, even though I am very uncompetitive with a single stack gun in a division that allows double stack. However, it's a lot of fun. But sticking to that, but tracking that as well. We see a lot of people when they eat, let's say they've got the foundations of information tracking or performance tracking, as we refer to it, right? Where they're keeping a logbook. The problem is, one day they're on their 2011 and they're running, from a 3 o'clock competition rig. And then the next day they're on their 365 running appendix and they're running the same exercise, but they look at that data without any context and they go, well, how come I was so fast on this day and not fast on this day? Oh man, I must be getting worse in my shooting. Right. And it's because
maybe you had a t-shirt you had to clear over your gun.
Exactly. Right. Or the fact that you've got a really tiny gun one day and you got a really big gun the other day, and just all these different variables. So we need to start eliminating or at least tracking those variables in our own practice. And then the understanding that there is an art to setting up your practice. You've got to have, that consistency of setting up your practice. For me, it's very rare that I have any types of setups that require more than like 3 target stands. And because of that, the more complex
I like 3 paper targets and 1 piece of steel. Like that's my favorite quick setup,
Yeah.
And then I can move stuff around. I can set up barrels for vision barriers. I can put cones on the ground. I can shoot all kinds of different drills on just that target array, maybe like a partial with a no shoot and a hardcover and an open, or, a double stack and an open and a no shoot partial and a popper set not to fall. So I don't have to go pick the damn thing up every rep.
Yeah, that's a pro move right there. Just get that thing not to fall.
I don't think the poppers I own have ever been set to fall. Like not once.
Yep. Yeah, because it's a pain. But it is. That's a great setup, right? And it doesn't, the more complex we think as the guys that go to the range, and we're like, I'm going to set up a stage every time I go to the range. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. You'll do that once. And then you'll recognize that it takes you an hour and a half to set that stuff up. And the last thing you want to do when you're done setting up is shoot it. And then you're just going to shoot it over and over and over again. You're really not learning anything because it's too much. It's too broad picture. It's not refined enough to make any significant progress in your shooting. And then you got to tear it down, and then you got to do all this other stuff, pick up your brass, so on and so forth, right? All these things take away from progress as a shooter.
And they take away from, like, you have a finite amount of time at the range. You have a finite amount of mental energy.
Absolutely.
You have a finite amount of physical energy. I would rather expend all of those things on actually working on the shooting.
100%. 100%. And that's really, we tout how much like, well, you should be doing most of, this kind of stuff in dry fire so that when you get to the range, you can do, live fire stuff and not have to worry about this dry fire stuff, like, working reloads and the draw and stuff like that. Right. Except that's not what happens when people go to the range. The first thing they do is they keep repeating the same stuff they do all the time instead of focusing on the important thing, which is actually shooting the gun. We're worried about the time of the draw. The draw is an administrative task when we break it down. You have to do it in order to start shooting the gun, right? But at its core, it's administrative. It has to happen before I shoot, right? The reload is the same thing. Now, there's urgency within those tasks, right? But they are just ways to help support shooting the gun. Our focus on the range should be for shooting the gun. And whatever that looks like, Tim and I do a really deep breakdown of what we consider the fundamentals of performance shooting, things like accuracy and speed and movement and vision, things of that nature, and how we want to work all those things and when. Most people way overstack, and we see this in the logbook. We way overstack our practice sessions. We try and do all the things, and if we don't have, the cognitive ability to get through all those things, you're just doing like, okay, well, if I do 3 reps of this and 3 reps of this and 3 reps of that, there's no repetition in there. You've gotten a ton of skills you've worked on with no refinement. I'm much more of a belief of you can work 1 or 2 things when you go to the range, but you need to rep those 1 or 2 things out. Tim has what we call the Timmy's rule of 10, which is how he breaks down, how he works on any individual task, from setting a baseline to looking for consistency to experimentation, within that, or exploration, as we call it, right? And then refinement, so on and so forth. But those are the ways we make progress. And in order to do that, it takes repetition. We have to shoot.
It can't be mindless repetition. It's got to be mindful repetition. You got to be paying attention to what's actually going on.
Yeah.
I threw the gun out there as fast as I could 10 times and cranked off a shot. Did I see an appropriate sight picture for the difficulty of the target? Did I use the appropriate trigger press for the difficulty of the target? How was my grip? Could I have done a bill drill with that same grip that I just shot 1 or 2 rounds with?
Yeah. So that's the big thing, right? Like anyone that's ever shot with me before knows I love bill drills, but most people, when they approach the bill drill, they do exactly, they do the normal stuff. Oh, I'm going to go shoot a bill drill, which means 7 yards, 2 seconds to an A zone from the holster, right? That's a bill drill. And they just shoot it. And their only goal is shooting it in 2 seconds because, Rob Latham said that's what you should be able to do. That's a terrible use of the bill drill. That's a performance metric, right? And all you end up doing is trying to race that time, and you don't learn anything. Now, your body starts to figure some things out, and it might get better with repetition, but you truly haven't learned, what did those sights look like? Because those sights and the way they track and recoil, like I go deep into this in my classes, right? That is telling you exactly what you're doing on your structure. It tells you how your grip is being formed. It's telling you how the pressures are being applied to the gun. But if you don't pay attention to that, you've lost everything. All you did was you sent, $1.50 worth of ammo or $2 worth of ammo downrange with no information.
Well, bill drill is my favorite drill for working on the grip.
As it should be. I think it's
as an isolation drill. Like experimenting, I like doubles. For experimenting, I like doubles. But that's a different thing, different paradigm. This is for refining what you've discovered in your experimentation.
Yeah,
I think the bill drill is the best drill for it, because if your grip isn't right, I don't care how fast you are and what you saw, you are not getting all alphas.
Yep, it's not going to happen.
Not when you're going full speed.
Nope. And that's, like I said, that is a way better use of the bill drill than just trying to hit 2 seconds. Honestly, I could not care how fast someone shoots a bill drill, right? I think, a 2-second bill drill is more or less nowadays a parlor trick, because people have figured out like, oh, I can cheat it and do this and do that, but it's better used as a diagnostic exercise. What is your grip doing? Can you really grip the gun? Because you can get away with a lot of shenanigans on 2 rounds. You really can.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
3 rounds? Nah. 4 rounds? Ooh. 6 rounds? No way, buddy.
Nope.
Not happening. Not happening. So yeah, I think that's a great use, how you're using it.
And things like the blade drill, once you get to a certain skill level, you can fix a bad grip between those targets.
Yes, you can. Right?
Bill drill, you can't do that.
Learn. No.
Yeah, bill drill, you can't do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the thing. You can utilize those things to really maximize performance.
No, absolutely. Well, we have already come up on an hour. It feels like 5 minutes, but we're not even, this conversation's not even close to being done. Do you mind if in a few months we come back on and keep it going?
I would love to. That would be fantastic. Sure. Yeah.
Well, before we close it out, let everybody out there know how they can get a hold of you for gunsmithing, art training, or, whatever other perverted, nonsensical reason they might have.
Indeed. I support it. So if you guys want to find more about me, you can, I'm pretty much all over the place. If you're interested in classes or gunsmithing or just want more information about stuff, check out my website. It's practicalperformance.org. And that'll have all the information about our new schedule. I'm not sure when this podcast will be released, but in the next couple days from when we're recording this, the 2025 schedule will be up. And this will be the first place you guys are probably going to hear it. In order to focus more on gunsmithing, there will only be about 25 opportunities for you to train with me in 2025. So that means if you see a class and you think you can make it, get into that one, because I've already got 25 on the schedule, which means I'm not really taking any more classes on. But you can sign up for all of those once the schedule is released on the website. You can find me on Instagram, the longest Instagram handle in the world, practical_performance_org. You can also check out the old backlogs of my podcast, which is the Practicast, where actually Matt was the first guest we ever had on, which we need to do again since we are.
Was I the first one?
Yep. You were the first outside guest.
I didn't realize that. Yeah, I didn't realize that.
Yep. You were the first outside guest we had on the show, which kind of paved the way for other guys, which now going into 2025, one of the benefits of not being on the road so much is that we're going to try and start bringing up
I have an idea back. Let's do a joint episode where we publish it. We both publish it. Let's do that. We'll set that up.
I'm in. Yeah, I'm totally in.
Let's do that for sure. So before we leave, I have one more joke I have to share with the audience, because I was really proud of this crack. It was when you and Tim were staying at my house. Remember this? You guys had just gotten there from the airport, and I looked at you both and said, you realize that between the three of us, we're the cast of Lord of the Rings.
Yes. And you're right.
We got Gandalf, we got Frodo, we got Gimli.
What can I say? And for anyone that follows me on Instagram, you know that there's a hashtag in there all the time that says Gimli special on it. You're right. You're right.
All right, brother. Well, we got to do some more of this because I really enjoyed it. I like the idea of a joint podcast. If you don't mind, I'd love to do that.
Oh,
we'll do that.
That sounds great. Sounds great. I'm all about it.
Cool. Well, everybody out there, hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you did, look for the joint podcast coming sometime soon to a RSS feed near you. And definitely, if you want some quality gunsmithing or some quality training, go ahead and check out my buddy AJ. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Way is in Training. Please come back again as we explore how training makes us better at our craft and better in our everyday lives. See all of you soon.